She would wake with his coat wrapped around her and his breathing slow with sleep just a few feet away. But in that moment, on the freezing road, hidden at the back of a rattling carriage, she had no way of knowing that the man who would save her from the cold was the same boy who had once promised never to let her disappear, because all she knew was the biting wind that cut through the thin wooden slats, the way the night clung to her skin like ice, and the quiet, desperate fear that had driven her to climb into the back of the carriage without permission, without a plan, without anything but the urgent need to leave her village before dawn, before the truth she carried could trap her there forever. And so she sat curled tightly between rough crates and tied bundles, her worn dress offering little protection against the cold, her fingers stiff and trembling as she pulled her shawl closer, though it did almost nothing to hold in warmth, the lantern at the side of the carriage swaying, with every uneven turn of the road, casting brief flickers of light that revealed just enough of her surroundings to remind her how out of place she was, how precarious her situation had become, because this was no ordinary traveler's cart. It belonged to someone of means, someone who rode inside while she hid among cargo like something forgotten or unwanted, and each time the carriage slowed or shifted, her breath caught, terrified that she might be discovered and thrown out into the night, left alone on a road that stretched endlessly into darkness. But no voice called out, no hand pulled back the cover, and the wheels kept turning, carrying her farther from everything she had known, farther from the small life she had been forced to leave behind, though her thoughts refused to stay quiet, circling back again and again to the moment she had fled, to the faces she had not said goodbye to the one face she had tried hardest not to remember, the boy by the river, the one who had once looked at her as if she mattered, as if the world beyond their small village could belong to both of them, even though it never could. Even though he had been destined for something greater, and she had always known it, had always felt the distance growing long before he left, long before silence replaced his voice and memory replaced his presence. And now, years later, she pushed the thought away with a sharp breath that turned to mist in the cold air, because memories would not keep her warm, and regret would not carry her forward. And yet the cold kept pressing in, seeping deeper with every mile, stealing the strength from her body little by little, until even sitting upright became an effort, her head beginning to dip despite her attempts to stay alert, her senses dulling as exhaustion wrapped around her more tightly than her shawl ever could. And still the carriage moved, steady and unrelenting, the rhythm of the wheels becoming something almost hypnotic, lulling her toward a dangerous kind of stillness, the kind that whispered it would be easier to stop fighting, easier to rest just for a moment, just long enough to escape the cold gnawing at her bones. And somewhere ahead, separated from her by little more than a wooden partition and the unspoken rules of class and distance, the man inside shifted slightly, a subtle movement that would have gone unnoticed if she had not been listening so carefully to every sound, every change, every sign that her presence might be discovered. And for a brief second, she froze completely, her breath held, her body tense, waiting for the inevitable call, the demand to know who she was and why she was there. But it did not come, and the silence that followed felt heavier than before, as if awareness had settled into the space between them, unspoken but undeniable. And still she did not move, did not dare to hope, did not dare to imagine that anything would change, because in her world, people like him did not notice. People like her, and even if they did, it was never for anything good. And so she remained where she was, hidden in plain sight, fighting a battle she was slowly losing as the cold tightened its grip, her fingers no longer responding as they should, her thoughts beginning to blur at the edges, her body giving in inch by inch despite her will to endure, until at last her head slipped sideways against a rough wooden crate, her eyes closing not in decision, but in surrender, her breathing shallow, her last fading awareness not of fear or regret, but of the strange, quiet realization that she might not make it to morning, that this road she had chosen might end here in silence and cold, unseen and unknown. And yet even as that thought flickered and dimmed, there was something else, a shift in the air, a presence drawing closer, deliberate and steady, as if someone had finally crossed the distance that was never meant to be crossed. Though she did not feel the coat settle around her shoulders, did not feel the warmth that would soon follow, did not see the man who had left his place to sit across from her in the dim, swaying light, because by then she had already slipped too far into the fragile edge of sleep, unaware that the night had changed, unaware that she was no longer alone, and unaware that when she opened her eyes again, everything she thought she had left behind would be waiting for her, closer than it had ever been before. When she woke, it was not to the cold, but to warmth, deep and steady, wrapped around her shoulders so completely that for a moment she lay still, confused, her mind slow to catch up with the unfamiliar comfort after a night that had nearly frozen the breath from her lungs. And as her senses sharpened, she became aware of the weight of something heavy draped over her, her fingers shifting beneath the fabric before carefully rising to touch it, tracing the smooth, thick material of a coat far too fine to belong to her, still holding the faint warmth of the person who had worn it. And that realization alone was enough to pull her fully awake, her eyes opening to the soft gray light of morning filtering through the carriage, the darkness of the night now fading into something quieter, gentler, and with a sudden, sharp breath, she pushed herself upright, the movement small but urgent as her gaze moved across the narrow space, and stopped. He was there, not at the front, not separated from her by distance and silence, but sitting just across from her at the back of the carriage, his posture relaxed, his head slightly bowed as sleep held him in place, one arm resting loosely at his side, the absence of his coat unmistakable now that she wore it. And for a long moment she could do nothing but stare, her heartbeat quickening as recognition rose slowly but undeniably within her, because even with the years that had changed him, even with the quiet strength that now marked his features where once there had only been boyish certainty, she knew him, not in the way one recognizes a stranger, but in the deeper, more certain way that comes from something shared, something once important enough to leave a mark that time could not erase. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the coat as memories pressed forward uninvited. The riverbank, the promises made too young to understand, the quiet goodbye that had never truly been spoken. And for a moment she lowered her gaze, as if doing so might steady the sudden rush of feeling that came with seeing him again like this, unexpected and impossibly close, because this was not just kindness, not just a passing gesture from a traveler to a stranger. This was him, the one person she had tried hardest to leave behind when she chose to run, now sitting within arm's reach as though the years between them had never existed at all. The carriage rocked gently beneath them, the steady rhythm of the wheels filling the silence as she forced herself to look at him again, studying the calm rise and fall of his breathing, the faint crease between his brows even in sleep, and the question she could not avoid settled quietly into her thoughts. Had he known it was her? Her gaze dropped briefly to the coat, her fingers brushing over it once more carefully this time, as if searching for an answer within its warmth, because this was no careless act, no thoughtless kindness. And yet she could not be sure, could not allow herself to believe too quickly that he had recognized her, not when the possibility of being wrong felt far easier to bear than the truth she was beginning to suspect. The carriage shifted suddenly over uneven ground, and the movement stirred him at last, the change subtle at first, a deeper breath, a slight movement of his hand, before his head lifted slightly, his eyes opening slowly, and in the quiet moment when his gaze found hers, everything seemed to still, the space between them tightening with something unspoken but undeniable. There was no confusion in his expression, only recognition. It was quiet, almost restrained, but she saw it clearly in the steadiness of his eyes, in the way he looked at her not as a stranger, not as someone misplaced in his carriage, but as someone he had already begun to understand before she had even woken. Neither of them spoke at first, because some silences carry more truth than words ever could. Her fingers curled slightly into the coat, grounding herself as she finally found her voice, though it came softer than she intended. "You gave me this." It was a simple statement, but it held everything she could not yet ask. His gaze did not leave hers. "No one should freeze in my carriage," he replied, his tone calm, measured, offering only the surface of his thoughts, and yet something deeper lingered beneath it, something unspoken that neither of them addressed. A brief pause followed. Then, more quietly, "I wondered if it was you." The words settled between them with quiet certainty, dissolving the last of her doubt. and she felt her breath catch as the weight of the moment fully arrived. Because whatever this was, chance, fate, or something far more complicated, it was no longer something she could ignore. Outside, the faint outline of a town began to emerge through the thinning fog, the world slowly waking around them. But inside the carriage, time seemed to hold just a little longer, as if giving them one final moment to sit within the fragile space between who they had been and who they had become, before everything changed. The carriage slowed as the morning fully broke, pale sunlight stretching across the road ahead while the distant town came into clearer view, its rooftops rising through the last threads of fading fog. And with it came the quiet return of reality, the end of the road, the end of the suspended moment that had held them between past and present. But neither of them moved right away, as if both understood that stepping out would mean stepping into everything left unsaid. And for a brief second she tightened the coat around her shoulders, not because she was cold anymore, but because it had become something more than warmth, something grounding, something that reminded her she had not imagined this, that he was truly here, that the boy she had once known now sat before her as a man who had crossed the distance between them without hesitation. And when the carriage finally came to a stop, the driver's voice faintly calling out their arrival, he rose first, steady and composed, though his eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary, as if waiting, not for an answer, but for a choice. She could leave. She could step down, disappear into the town, and let this moment become nothing more than a strange twist of fate, a fleeting intersection of two lives that had once briefly touched. Or she could stay, not in the carriage, but in the truth of what stood between them. Slowly, she stood as well, her fingers brushing over the edge of the coat before she finally slipped it from her shoulders, holding it carefully for a second, as if deciding whether to return it or keep what it now represented. And when she stepped closer, the space between them no longer divided by distance or silence, she offered it back, but did not let go immediately. "Thank you," she said softly, though the words carried far more than gratitude. His hand closed gently over the coat, but instead of taking it fully, he paused, his gaze steady on hers. "You don't have to run this time," he said, just as quietly. The words settled deep, not as a demand, not as a promise, but as something open, something patient. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, slowly, she released the coat, but did not step away. Outside, the world moved on. People waking, voices rising, life continuing as it always did. But between them, something that had once been lost had found its way back, not unchanged, not untouched by time, but still there, still real. And this time, she didn't turn away.